Welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. I visited South Africa about 3 years ago, and one thing stood out to me. The companies there were producing world-class products and selling them all over the world to US, Europe, Japan, and many other countries. And I wondered how this tiny little country has so many of these suppliers who are so competitive in their products and are able to sell them all over the world, even though they don't have a large space program or a space agency. And this allowed me to reflect on our own supply chain and vendor base of India and Indian companies doing space. One of the biggest factors that why these South African companies are competitive is because they control the entire intellectual property and the product design as well as development, and not just the manufacturing of it, which means that they can now sell this as an entire product to not just the local market, which is almost non-existent in South Africa, but are able to export. In this episode of the NewSpace India podcast, I talked to Lihandi, who works at a company called NewSpace Systems in South Africa, which is a company that exports almost 98% of its products outside of South Africa in commercial markets. I thought this is an excellent episode to reflect on why some of these South African companies are extremely competitive in the space market and are able to export 95% plus of their products, while in India, the people supplying to the ISRO supply chain have less than possibly 5% of exports abroad. This episode is also a reflection on how the South African and the larger African ecosystem is organized, especially from a new space lens, and gives us an overview of what are the challenges that they face there to then compare with what we face in India. I hope that this comparison that we do between what is happening in South Africa and what is happening in India brings a lot of insights on what they are doing right, which we can replicate, and what they are doing wrong that we can avoid. Overall, clearly the roadmap is to help our companies to become product owners and then use the low-cost nature of operations and infrastructure and manpower in India and make competitive space products that people can export around the world rather than just be locked as manufacturers who really don't control anything with respect to product design or space-related hardware. Hi Lee, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. It's a pleasure talking to you.
You as well, Narayan. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
South Africa is an extremely interesting phenomena in the new space world, I would say. The time when I visited South Africa and you guys, it was very interesting to see how the industry has grown there. And I thought there's a lot of lessons that we can take from you guys. And so I wanted to make this conversation with you happen so that we understand how some of the industry has grown there and, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities that you see, and maybe take some lessons for us in India from all of your experiences. So, just to begin this conversation, I would like to have your perspective on how the space activities in South Africa evolved over the course of time and, where does it stand now from your perspective?
Sure. Again, I would just like to thank you for the time. You have been a very big proponent always for looking at the peripheries and what's happening there. And I think South Africa is just one of those cases. We've actually been involved in space and space activities since the 50s, which most people don't know. We were quite heavily involved with NASA on several of their sort of downlinking a lot of their data for various missions that they did in the 50s. So we were part of the Deep Space Network. And again, a lot of people don't actually know that we were so heavily involved with those programs and tracking satellites and doing that sort of downlinking. And then from there, subsequently, the South African government actually invested quite heavily in setting up satellite integration and testing facilities. So HOTEC was established, and we also had launch capabilities at that time as well. So that all sort of led up to the creation of the first satellite, which, although most people don't know this, there were some programs happening in the background, which, due to the change in regime, were never launched. So there was a lot of capacity and know-how being built up in South Africa over the years. And that sort of spawned into the creation of SunSpace. So SunSat was the first satellite built by Stellenbosch University and was effectively launched in 1999. So already that was quite different to what we were seeing in Africa and a lot of the other developing space nations at that time. A lot of them were working with international partners, and there would be some knowledge transfer component, but mostly the satellite was being built by a external entity. In South Africa, that wasn't the case. We were able to build the 65 kg satellite SunSat, in South Africa, and that was effectively launched in 1999, which just illustrates how much know-how and capacity were already within the South African industry at that time. And then following on from that, SunSpace was created as a result of that, and they work quite closely with the South African government, the Department of Science and Technology, to effectively launch the second satellite, Sumandile-Sat, in 2009. So there was a lot happening at that time, but not within the framework of a space agency. That only came much, much later. That was in, I think, 2013 only. So the industry itself actually preceded the space agency, and unfortunately the downfall of SunSpace, which was largely as a result of being too dependent on government funding, in my mind, is one of the reasons why we have such a strong industry in South Africa, because that know-how that was built up within SunSpace then sort of flowed back into the industry, flowed back into the university, and went into the different parastatals and government. So a lot of the big players like SES Aerospace Group, Samira, a lot of the sort of existing companies happened as a result of the collapse, I would say, or the close down of SunSpace. So what we are seeing now in South Africa is really just the second spawning, I would say. So it started with several companies in industry who are now effectively creating spin-outs of their own. And we are increasingly seeing spin-outs from the universities and so on. So we're in a very exciting time in South Africa. And I think, at least within the Africa context and within a lot of the various developing space nations, we seem to be unique in that we have quite a thriving industry where a lot of the other nations tend to find that their space activities are concentrated within the universities or within government. So it is quite a unique space.
So you talked about the collaboration with NASA leading to the university building the satellite in 1999. During this period, was it, given that the space agency was only formed recently, who was it that the partner was in this key collaborations? Was it some research institutes by the government, or why was not a space agency formed?
So at the time, there were, as you said, some research institutes, but also the Department of Science and Technology really led the charge on this, and they were the ones who worked quite closely with industry on the second satellite, Sumandile-Sat. So there was government collaboration, and even today still Hartebeeshoek, which is the ground segment in South Africa, that is being run by SANSA. So that capability resides within government effectively, and they are the main stakeholders at that time who were working with NASA and so on.
1999, you said, the university launched the satellite in South Africa, and there was just one company that was spinned off of this, or were there other companies that also took charge of some of the IP?
So what effectively happened was, with the launching of SunSat, only one company was formed, and that was SunSpace. And that was made up of a lot of the university professors and people who had been actively involved in the building of SunSat. And when SunSpace eventually ended up going out of business, because after Sumandile-sat, that was a satellite built effectively 10 years later, there was just not sufficient funding to really keep the company going. So that IP that was residing within SunSpace was effectively bought out by the government. So all of that IP flowed back into government, but there was a big payout at that time for the IP, and several then of the local companies formed as a result. So key players like Dr. Sias Mostert ended up starting his own company, SES Aerospace Group, which covers the full value chain. People like Johan de Toy, he went in for founded Samira. There were a lot of professors like Prof. Herman Stein, who ended up going back to Stellenbosch University. So we saw this flow back of this know-how and IP sort of going back to the universities, but also going into the industry. So the South African government effectively took over a lot of that IP, but were very willing to share this IP within the industry at a royalty fee, etc. So, and then the companies themselves could effectively take that IP and take that into new products, which they could effectively sell to the international market.
One of the interesting comparisons that you could do here is something with UOSAT, or the University in Surrey, and then the SSTL spawning out of it. And in fact, SSTL helping some of the African countries like Nigeria establish, I think, some capabilities. So the logic behind SunSpace on commercialization of the products from SunSpace, was it that SunSpace was this only company in African continent that could produce these satellites at that time, and was the logic that then they could then sell this capability to other African nations? Or why did the business model fail, or the company fail to expand, let's say, within Africa itself?
So I wasn't there at the time, so I'm going to speak under correction, and maybe some of the people who are there would differ with me. But from what I have gathered and through conversations with a lot of the stakeholders that were actively involved in SunSpace, I think one of the biggest problems were at the time they were really trying to get the South African space program, I would say, up and running. And so there was a lot being done with the South African government at that time. And I think eventually the idea was that they would then offer those services to other nations. But at that time, as you say, a lot of the African countries were already tied in or working quite closely within Europe, or already had ties with other countries who could make it quite lucrative for them. Where in the case of South Africa, and to a certain extent this is still the case now, there seems to be quite a skepticism within Africa of even our own capabilities. People seem to not trust themselves enough. So we have found that even where there maybe resides the capability or the product or whatever it may be, if an African country would rather prefer to buy in from Europe than they would to buy in from another African country. So I think there is still some barrier there within and among the African countries themselves, in that there is competition and there is almost a skepticism of our own locally produced technology, which doesn't always make sense, but that's just something that I've seen over the years. So I think SunSpace, their demise was partially due to a lack of local funding from the South African government, and partially due to there being a barrier of, at that time, really trusting in African technology. So people would rather, as you say, go to SSTL or to other international actors to try and do that technology transfer. And I mean, as we look back now, the history shows that those technology transfer programs weren't very successful, and is part of the problem, I think, as to why a lot of the African programs to a certain extent did stall, because there was a lack of sufficient knowledge transfer during these programs. So I think one of the things in South Africa that was great was we have seen the government work quite closely with the universities. There's been a lot of great technology that has essentially been generated within the universities, and that has been spun out and commercialized into companies. So that in South Africa, we've managed to retain the know-how and IP and spin those out into commercial ventures, which has also helped our local industry quite a lot.
So you did talk about a lot of the local industry now predating the space agency. And I love the name of your space agency, by the way, Sansa. It's a very Game of Thrones phenomena. And so the South African National Space Agency, or Sansa, I guess, was formed, I guess, more recently. So what is the kind of the relationship that Sansa holds with the local industry now? And, what is their mandate? Why was it formed the way it was formed recently?
So I think the realization was that, okay, South Africa is now doing space. For better or worse, companies were being formed and the government had to respond to that. So they effectively generated or created SANSA with the idea that in that body would effectively orchestrate the industry and help to support and grow it. And would also channel funding to it. So that was the idea behind SANSA. But as you say, they do have a tough job in that they were sort of formed on the back end of sort of this industry, which has just continued to grow. And now they're sort of trying to play catch up and trying to understand, okay, who are the players, what's being done. A lot of the various companies and entities already have very tightly formed collaboration and partnerships with international bodies and players. So there's a lot. And so to really understand what is happening with the industry and how best SANSA can support that industry is a tough ask. And at the moment, we don't in South Africa have sort of a trade organization or anything like that. So SANSA is really doing the legwork, having to go around and try and chat to all the various players and see how they can best support this industry, which effectively exists. So they are sort of trying to play catch up a little bit. But I must say that they've been very open with industry, and at very strategic and key times in the formulation of both the policies. So there was a couple of years ago, we had to rewrite some of our space-related regulations and so on because they were quite outdated. And at the time, SANSA was very good to include industry in those discussions when it comes to the allocation of funding for programs or the upgrading of various facilities. Like now, we're going through pre-pandemic, there was a big drive to put some money towards refurbing some of the test facilities up at HOTEC. And that was all done in collaboration with industry and in sort of talks with industry. So SANSA is trying very hard, at least on the upstream side of things, to collaborate with the industry and to make sure that they are facilitating the growth of that industry. But it is hard. And it's, to a certain extent, they are playing a little bit of catch up at this point. So I think for us in South Africa, we are trying to work with SANSA, but as with most things, government funding tends to be slow, and the programs themselves tend to be quite sporadic. So the unfortunate thing is that, fortunate and unfortunate for SANSA, is that the industry itself is just going on and continuing to form partnerships and sell globally, and where they can work with SANSA, but not sort of waiting around for those plans or those programs to materialize.
I wanted to ask you how many companies are present in South Africa that service the space sector in some form or the other. Maybe a breakup of also how many participate in the upstream and downstream, and also perhaps also the size of them.
So that would be really hard for me to say. I would say on the upstream, the actual companies that I know of that are actively working in the space sector, maybe. Oh, I don't want to leave someone out now. Wait, I'm going to have to make a quick list of them. But so within just, if we take something like SCS's aerospace group, for example, that was a whole host of companies that sort of formed under just that one entity. There were companies spanning consulting, spacecraft missions, the various components, and then also the downstream, so data sales and data applications. So just within that one group, you effectively had 5 smaller companies that were working on the various parts of the space value chain. Outside of that, we've had 2 companies spin out of 2 different universities. We have a company solely working on AIT. We've got companies doing just the sort of ground segment part of things. And yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, maybe we are in total 20 companies covering both the up and downstream. But probably there may be more that I'm missing. But the companies themselves are not big. The various companies, I would say most of us are about 20 people, 20 to 30 people, some much smaller, maybe 5 people. So it really depends. I mean, I think it's really hard to try and define the space industry in South Africa so tightly. We're very small companies, and they're constantly shuffling and reshuffling themselves. We're at the point where we're seeing spin-outs out of spin-outs. So, for example, Samira Saints is now a sort of spin out of some of the technology which was being developed within Samira. And we've had situations like CPUT where they had their lab, and they've now had a spin out of Maya. Stellenbosch University had a spin out of CubeSpace. It's really, really hard to say, but the industry itself is really thriving, and there seems to be companies cropping up every day or so, especially now that there has been some VC funding coming up. But we are really seeing companies covering the full space value chain. So as I said, on the downstream, people like Pink Matter, GeoTerra, doing more the satellite data and applications and imagery and so on. And then on the upstream, people like our company, NewSpace Systems, CubeSpace, Samira, Sense, they're doing more the component and the subsystem level. And then you've got people like the various universities, SES, Southern Space, Denel Space Tech, a lot of primes doing more the mission level type stuff. So the industry itself is very broad, and it would be hard for me. And I'm fearing for my life that I've missed someone. And I know I have Strafika doing AIT, and X in a Box doing more of your outreach type things. So yeah, it's there's a lot happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could always, make a list and then put that in the notes of this episode. So that's always a possibility. So, but you're very kind enough to try to recollect everyone, and not to make sure that you include everyone. So, we talked about a little bit of these companies now, and how much of SANSA's funding or National Space Agency's funding, flows into these companies. Because for me, it seems like a very nifty group of small companies that are, developing products of their own and trying to sell them commercially, and doing it very, very commercially than, most of the parts of the world where most companies just depend on government money. So can you, give a briefing on how much of government money flows into some of these companies, or how dependent are these companies on local government money against, selling this on the commercial market?
So there's funding for the actual space programs, which happen in two ways. So Denel Space Tech is the main government prime who has received quite a large sum of funding from the government to do the EOSat-1 program and also to refurbish HOTEC. So there was a sizable amount of investment that was put towards that. And then also universities like CPUT and their recent spin out Amaya, who have received quite a bit of funding to continue on with their CubeSat constellation, which they are looking to do, which is more related to maritime sort of awareness and that sort of thing. So there is chunks of funding going towards programs, and the idea would be is that those companies or entities would then use mostly local components and subsystems. But those programs themselves, as we've seen now with EOSat-1, that started in 2017, and the program itself has stalled. So the other forms of funding really is on a smaller scale. So there is some government grants which are more related to infrastructure development. There are some funding available for human capacity development. There are some grants available for if you are an SME and you are Black owned, so BEE, there is some support for those SMEs. So there are small chunks of funding made available, but as with most countries in the developing world, there is a very limited budget for space. There was a recent article now in which SANSA has dedicated quite a sizable amount of money to space infrastructure. So I think it was like 3 billion rand, which is being invested, but a lot of that will end up going to HOTEC and to the existing government facilities. So as a small NewSpace entity, and I can speak as NewSpace Systems, barring some government support on product level development, so if your product is past a certain TRL level, you can apply for some grant funding on a product level, but that's very, very little. So we have not actually leveraged or been able to get any other government support, barring some support on the product level, and I know that's the same for a lot of the other new space actors. So CubeSpace through the university received some support, but other than that, they have been dependent on sales. NewSpace Systems is dependent on sales. Samira Sense, we're all dependent very much on just making international sales, and I think that has been part of both a blessing and a curse. Of course, it would be nice to have a security blanket of a space agency that has sufficient funding to keep the industry going, but that isn't the case in South Africa. So we have had to be very lean, and that's why our companies are very small, as I said, sort of ranging from 5 people to 20, 30 people, really maximum. And that's because we have to be very lean, we have to be very competitive, and we have to ensure that our products are really meeting a need and there are clients for it. So we are very limited and we can't really go for pie in the sky type things. We have to really just try and find something that will be a really viable business model, because we don't really have that safety net of SANSA funding.
Yeah, I see a lot of differences from, let's say, an ecosystem in India, for example, because I think in India we had the space agency, and the space agency more or less having the IP, and industry being just born to service them and taking over the IP from ISRO and just manufacturing it. So I think the fundamental makeup of how industry works in India, or traditional industry works in India, against how the industry works in South Africa is quite different in that sense. And also I think the other phenomena that you talked about of professors turning into entrepreneurs is also extremely interesting, and I think that's also something that we actually haven't seen much in India happen as well. So in this trade related activity, if you had to take a guess on what would be the percentage of exports that South African industry in space to outside of South Africa against trade within the country?
So, as I said, there are only really 2 space programs happening at the moment, and space data being used for application with outside of the government is not really a thing yet within South Africa. So we don't have a lot of downstream companies per se. So from a NewSpace perspective, we're pretty much 98% export. Some of the companies are 100% export, because there isn't a consistent program that we are really supplying to. So hypothetically, when EOSat 1 starts procuring again, there would be potential for NewSpace to sell some of its products into that program, but that program for now is halted. So there really isn't anything at the upstream going on in South Africa. So there is some, as I said, grant funding happening at a product level, which maybe accounts for that 2% or 1% of funding. But beyond that, it really just is us exporting our products and missions and consultancy and that sort of thing to the international market. I would just like to say there is a lot of collaboration. The one thing within South Africa, which is always nice to see, is that there is a lot of collaboration happening between the various entities. And so that has really helped us to be quite aggressive in the international market and to work together, I suppose would be a right way to say that, to work together to be able to offer clients a more comprehensive or a closed loop solution, if you can call it that.
So one of the challenges in our industry is that customer development is actually extremely hard, and most often you see most companies just looking at local customers. In either the case of the US or Europe or Japan or most of the countries, people tend to look at their own borders to get initial customers. And in the case of South Africa, you're having customers all around the world. You said a figure of 98% is quite amazing to hear. So how is it that you can do these kind of customer development and business development and build confidence in customers who are in a separate continent altogether and trying to sell your products?
That's a good question. I think each company has had its own breakthrough moments. So let me put it this way. A lot of the spin-outs from the universities has seen success because they were involved in, for example, the QB50 program. So that really put them on the map and got them a lot of the future work that they have subsequently had. In the case of NewSpace, NewSpace Systems, that is the company I work for, we were different in the sense that we came with European IP and there was already quite a bit of heritage to the products we were selling. So we did have we were better set up from the get-go than maybe some of the other NewSpace companies in South Africa. Each one has had a different approach, as I said. So some of the universities, QB50 programs, others were lucky in that they were spin-outs from existing companies, which gave them access to the market, if you can put it that way. So Samira Sense could work off the basis that Samira Group had quite a lot, had a lengthy time in the industry and knew a lot of people, and that definitely helped them get the leg up there. So it really depends. Every company has been different and their story will be very different in how they've managed to sort of gain that success within the international industry. But I think one thing I have realized in the last couple of years is that South Africa is becoming now renowned for our products and services, and that's also helped the new up-and-comers, is that people now don't think twice about, we know South Africa, okay, we've met a couple of companies, and so they're less skeptical and less worried about using new technologies coming out of South Africa. So I think it all helps. But yes, it would be hard to say exactly what has been the one thing that has helped us. But I would say that initially there was a lot of government funding for the Sunspace sort of group. and they then had some money and some heritage and IP, which when that sort of collapsed, spun out into the different companies, which then gave those companies a level of credibility, which they could then use to get more clients. So I would say it's really hard as a real new space company which doesn't have any heritage, then making it in the space industry, especially if you're trying to break into the international market, it's exceptionally difficult because everyone wants heritage. But that's why I think we're seeing a lot of new space players in South Africa are more at a tier 2 level, because I definitely think, and it's just my opinion, that trying to break into the market as a prime, especially as a new space prime who doesn't have any heritage or sufficient capital or government support to really make it, that's really, really hard. At a component level, at a subsystem level, as a tier 2 supplier with less heritage, I think it's definitely easier to break it into the market, especially if you've got a good price point. Then people will be more likely to buy from you and tend to be a little bit less risk adverse than at a mission level where they're paying a lot of money and it's a big investment. So that's just my sort of experience in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, these are fantastic insights, actually. I think some of this can stand as inspiration to a lot of the people in the developing world. So you talked about some of the spin-offs, especially like, CubeSpace and others that have come up through the universities. What would be, the funding that is available for some of these, IP to be taken from university missions to companies to generating these startups? Because I imagine that there's also not much of a big venture capital scene in South Africa when these companies were formed.
Exactly. So again, it depends completely on the university and their structure. So CPUT has received a lot of funding from the Department of Science and Technology to fund their CubeSat development program, and that helped them to lead to the spin out of Amaya. And a lot of that IP would be royalty based and so on. So I mean, how that exact structure would look is difficult for me to say, as I'm not really involved in the university sort of scene. But then in the space, in the CubeSpace sense, that was through within Stellenbosch University. They have a body called Innovus, which effectively looks at commercializing technology within Stellenbosch University, and they help spin out. So CubeSpace, for example, is situated in a launch lab, which is not just space companies, it's a lot of different companies that have effectively been spun out of Stellenbosch University. So there's a mechanism for that, whereby they help companies initially spin out of the university. So it really depends on the university and the structure and so on. And each of those companies have had a different story. So yeah, I would probably not be the best person to comment on that. But I think an interesting thing now is that we are seeing some VC funding happening, not at that level yet. I mean, CubeSpace and those companies, they're quite old already. They've been around for several years, but more recently there has been some VC funding of very, very new companies that have spun out in the last year or so. There have been some international VC funding and so on. So we're even seeing a shift there in that new space companies in South Africa are starting to attract some international interest. But again, I think it's just purely based on the fact that there is such a the companies in South Africa tend to be, as I said, quite lean and quite internationally competitive, which is why they're drawing this VC funding. Whereas I find that if you're in countries like the US or Europe, where VCs abound, if you just have a good idea, then you're likely to get funding. In South Africa, that's not the case. Most of the companies getting VC funding have more than just a good idea. They have a proven business case and they've sold some stuff and they've had to go that extra mile to prove that they're a viable business, which in turn has helped those companies in the long run because they were already a successful business. They maybe just needed some additional capital. So I think that's one of the biggest differences and why we're seeing a lot of the new space companies in South Africa succeed, as opposed to maybe in Silicon Valley, where you see a lot of these VC funded companies not make it in the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's just an amazing story, I would say, because, in comparison, I would say a lot of the Indian companies, I think, are still, even in the new space realm, I guess, are looking at the local market because, of course, the local market in India is big enough if they can occupy some of it. So I guess, it really, there's some, differences there, and also maybe the local venture funding scene in India is a little bit more mature today with a lot more money available in venture capital funding in India today, I guess, than a place like South Africa. So again, some of the interesting contrasts here are quite stark. What makes these companies competitive? Is this because there's control over the IP and genuine cutting edge IP being produced at the same time, cost of operations and cost of manpower being smaller than European or American geographies? What are the mix of things that makes these companies very competitive?
I think, as you say, so we're lucky to be based in a low-cost economy, so that definitely helps. We're able to manufacture and produce products which are at a level which is competitive in terms of quality and performance, which is competitive in the international market, but which we can produce at maybe a fraction of the cost that you would see in Europe and the US. So I think that definitely helps. And because of the proven track record, I would say, of South Africa and the increasing credibility of South African companies, that is helping us gain a foothold internationally. If I can just put it this way, even my company, NewSpace Systems, we are supporting 50 customers globally across 5 continents. We're doing a lot, but our team is still just 20 people. So we really, really focus on what we would say lean manufacturing, being incredibly flexible and agile and effectively, even myself, it doesn't matter to what tier of management you get to, you're still expected to do at least 3 people's jobs. And it's just really maintaining that lean kind of mindset and being very, very focused on what the end product is and who the client is and what problem you're trying to solve. So I think in South Africa, there's a real focus on trying to solve a problem. And because we have had this existing experience working at more mission level, which has sort of permeated to a large sense all of the various spin-outs, we know what primes struggle with. We have an insight into what our clients are really looking for. And so we've really sort of structured ourselves to try and address a demand within the market. And I think that has been really crucial to why a lot of the various companies have been so successful. So I think price is a factor, but I also just think being very, very focused on what the client needs and trying to address the demand in the industry has been vital. Because what I'm seeing in a lot of countries that have a lot of VC funding or have a lot of government support is that people have the freedom, I suppose, which is great, to come up with novel ideas, which are just nice ideas and great and cool technology. But there maybe isn't a market yet, or there isn't really a demand, or people don't really see the necessity of it. And so it's a great idea and a lot of money has gone into it, but effectively that company doesn't have a very solid business model. And I see that quite a lot when I speak to people at conferences, is that people chase the technology, but then after the fact try and come up with a need for it, if you could call it that. And in South Africa, we just, again, don't have that luxury. So we are very focused on who the end client is, what are we trying to sell, and how we can be competitive within that existing market.
So what would be the challenges for companies like yours and other companies? Is it that you constantly need to, look out for these international customers and keep doing what you have to do, and then remain lean and mean kind of a business, or what are the kind of challenges, and maybe challenges where even the local government or other stakeholders could also help you.
So I think the challenges will depend very much on where you are situated in the South African industry. So if you are, for us as NewSpace Systems, sometimes the challenge for us is that a lot of the government funding is already being channeled into the various entities, which effectively almost set those entities as competitors to you. So sometimes government can be a hindrance to us. And then on top of that, of course, the space industry itself is one of the most competitive, and it's constantly changing, and it's very demanding. So people are frequently wanting more for less. But at the same time, what we're finding a lot now as a NewSpace company is we're almost stuck between two worlds, because you have the CubeSat people who are starting to build more and more reliable CubeSats, and so their demands are becoming more, and they want more robust products. And at the same time, the old space people are trying to become more new spacey, but they themselves are still entrenched in a certain way of thinking in terms of the documentation they require, the processes they want to go through. And so as a new space company, you're sort of caught in this very weird gray a part of the industry, which is you're trying to be commercial, you're trying to be competitive, you're trying to be cost and performance, and you're trying to keep all of these things in balance. But the customer itself is, they're still trying to figure out where they themselves fall. So one of the biggest challenges that we have at the moment is just trying to find the sweet spot with our clients, whereby you can meet all of their performance and quality and delivery schedules, while at the same time still meeting their price requirements, because people want to be new space because they want the cost to be lower, but at the same time they come in with all their ESA paperwork or CNES level requirements, which is not feasible when you are trying to build things to a new space standard. So I think what new space is and what that sort of what that means at an industry level is still something which to me isn't very well defined. And so clients sort of range on the spectrum of being, okay, cool, I want 2 of those, and just buying it and not really caring too much, to saying, okay, but we want to do a full EQSR, and we want to go through all the hoops, and we want to do all of this additional testing, and we want and. So as a new space company, I frequently sit with the challenge of trying to help our clients figure out what would be sufficient for them. Like, how can we get them into the new space sector? Because a lot of companies struggle with the concept of new space and what new space really means.
So one of the important aspects of how I see an ecosystem like South Africa or even India mature is integrating space products and services into the local economy. If we can do that more genuinely and connect the upstream companies and downstream companies strongly, and that capability connects to the local economy through various products and services that people are offering to banks or so on. So that's when I think there's this evolution of primes that are possible in geographies like India and South Africa, which are non-governmental primes, right? So do you see that happening, or how strong is the integration of space into the local economy in space?
At the moment, because we have limited satellites at a data level, there isn't much integration between the primes and the downstream sort of application type people. But there are definitely a lot of application-based companies which are being created, some of which use space data, but maybe not necessarily South African space data. So I definitely see that there is some of that happening, but there is still a very big divide between upstream and downstream. But I think from a SANSA perspective, especially within their Earth observation unit, they are really trying to find ways to create linkages between the various sectors. And as you've said, I completely agree. It's only then when you have a fully harmonious and interacting ecosystem that you can really have a sustainable one. At the moment, South Africa is not there yet. I think it's something we're working towards, and I think that's definitely something I think we're going to see more of in the next, 5 years or so, is going to be this move towards a more integrated ecosystem. But at this present time, we are still trying to figure that out.
One of the things that I noticed, especially from the African context, is Africa is often pitched as almost like one country, right? People say Africa, space in Africa, Africa in space, and African Space Agency. Coming from a country like India, I know how big and diverse just India is, and how difficult it is to connect people just within India, depending on the culture and language and other things. And Africa is like 10 times the size of India, and the complexity, I'm sure, is almost 10 times bigger as well. Does this narrative of African Space Agency and an African space collaboration really work in practice, or is this something more of a theory or a thesis that people want to achieve?
I think it's a little bit of both. If we look at past experience, there was the ARMC, which was meant to be a constellation of African satellites, which was focused on disaster management. And that never really materialized because the various African countries which had sort of co-opted into this idea of doing the constellation, we couldn't get our schedules to align, and funding just wasn't available at the same time, and so this idea of this constellation just never really materialized. And that is one of the biggest challenges in Africa is trying to align it is trying to align all the different countries. As you say, especially when it comes to space, each of the African countries have such a different, they've followed such a different path, and each one is at a different level of capacity and capability, and each one has a different set of funding and what they can do or can't do. And at times, it's very hard in Africa when we are struggling with pandemic or militant groups or any famine or these sort of larger societal issues to really then commit to a set funding for space. And I think, so in practice, the idea of an African Space Agency, I think, will help us hopefully to collaborate more. As I mentioned earlier, there is still this thing of countries like Ghana or Nigeria, they would rather send their students to Japan to go to QTech, and they would rather buy in parts from Europe than they would to send students perhaps to South Africa or vice versa. So within Africa, we aren't as a continent really working together when it comes to space. I think there has been some programs and there has been some efforts to try and increase that collaboration, but it has been very limited. So I think my hope with the African Space Agency is that we will be able to coordinate our efforts better. But I think in practice, it's going to be very hard because the countries are at just such different levels in their sort of space journey, and people have very different ideas of how that should look. So some countries haven't focused on satellite hardware at all. Their main focus has been on the downstream and just looking more at the application and how space data can be used in that sense. And then you get other countries like South Africa, which has been more focused on just the satellite hardware side of things. So people have different ideas, and it's going to be hard to get everyone to agree and to even commit to specific funding. And even if they commit to specific funding, to then actually get the funding, just because things change. So I am hopeful that the African Space Agency will help with just more the collaboration efforts and streamlining that and getting countries to talk to one another. But in practice, and whether tomorrow we'll have a working ESA type agency, I think is unlikely.
Yeah, I mean that's really a cultural issue, I guess, on how people look at your own. Often a prophet is not often accepted in his own land. So in that sense, it's also interesting because I guess because South African companies, especially you guys, have not been dependent on a lot of the government funding, and also it doesn't affect regime changes in government and political party changes and other phenomena. You're also kind of guarded by all of that because you're competitive in that sense, right? Because if you take a country like I guess Nigeria, where at some point of time they had a huge investment in space, now not so much, right?
Yes, no, definitely. I think, and we've seen it in South Africa as well, as things have changed, as different presidents have come on board, their agendas differ. So if you are very much dependent on government funding, then you're going to have a problem. And because we haven't, that has definitely helped us a lot in just being able to maintain the industry growth that we've had in South Africa.
So you touched a little bit earlier on the regulatory framework, being created alongside the help of SANSA and so on. So how has this space policy or law aspects evolved in South Africa so far? Were you easily able to export a lot of the competitive, products that you develop are dual use, because a lot of reaction wheels and many other star trackers and so many other subsystems that sensors that you guys developed are all dual use. So was this in place already when these companies were created, or was this created newly? How has this evolved?
So there has always been mechanisms for export control, and a lot of people don't know this, but South Africa is pretty strict. So we have two bodies controlling export restricted goods or export controlled goods. So we have to jump through quite a lot of hurdles to export, and South Africa is signed up to several treaties, UN treaties and so on. So from the South African government perspective, they are really trying to ensure that they are following the sort of international guidelines and being a good global citizen from that aspect. So at some points in time, it is actually difficult doing business in South Africa because it is quite tough to export. There's a lot of rules and things that need to be applied. But that's the case in any country. So if you're signed up to the various bodies and following the correct processes, then I would suppose it's like any other country, where you just have to follow those rules. Yeah, so from a regulatory perspective, it's there. It's quite robust, especially, as I said, when dealing with goods that are dual use or more sensitive in nature. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's hampered business, but it can be challenging, as with any company that has to deal with government regulations.
Is there anybody in South Africa who keeps track of how many jobs are being created by the space industry locally, and how much is the contribution to the GDP? Although, you said the companies are quite small, but still, it's something very interesting that I see not many developing countries do.
So within the Department of Trade and Industry, with space being one of the sectors that they're closely monitoring, they are definitely keeping track of that. So we get almost yearly surveys from them to complete. So what is our current employee count? What is our turnover? That sort of thing. So they are monitoring it at a departmental level and using that to sort of then advocate for additional spending or additional funding at a more higher senior treasury level. trying to then get some additional funding for us by using those numbers as a as proof that this industry is doing something.
Right, and this has been, a wonderful chat. I guess there's a lot of insights, and I took almost an hour of your time in all of this. So I just want to end, this conversation by asking you, where do you see, the South African ecosystem, and maybe even the larger African ecosystem in NewSpace, and all of this evolve in the next 5 years?
So, from the South African perspective, what we're seeing now is, I think, sort of the next phase. So we've had the spin-outs, and now we're sort of seeing the spin-outs on spin-outs, and we are starting to see some international investment coming into the country, especially as related to space. So I think, especially on the upstream, we are definitely seeing sort of the next phase of companies that will be coming out of South Africa, which I'm very excited about. But I do think that there is that link between downstream and upstream that's still missing, but that's actively being worked on by the various government entities and so on. So I think within the next 5 years or so, we're going to be seeing maybe a more collaborative ecosystem within South Africa, and definitely more downstream players as Sansa, Earth observation and so on start pushing more of the application focused companies that are more on the application focused sector. So I think that's where I sort of see South Africa heading, and I'm really excited about what we're seeing happening in the industry. I think the growth of the industry is really positive. In terms of Africa, it's really hard to say. As you said yourself, the countries themselves are so diverse, but we are seeing definitely in terms of countries and CubeSats and so on, through working with QTech, we've now had several of the African countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Ethiopia and so on actually launching CubeSats, and that has really fired up a enthusiasm for space within those various countries. And so I think we're going to see more of an emphasis, I think, in the coming years on maybe more the upstream, where previously in Africa I think there was more an emphasis on the downstream applications. So it's going to be interesting. I think each country, depending on what happens, this pandemic definitely didn't help. I think that slowed a lot of the progress down in terms of Africa and space in Africa. And I think this is going to be a challenging time for companies to try and weather this storm. But I think within Africa, the people tend to be very innovative, and we tend to be quite resilient. So I think that this is going to just be one more thing that we will overcome. And I hope that at the end of the day, in the next 5 years or so, Africa will be a much stronger player. There's definitely the need for space in Africa. So I would love to see the industry in the various countries grow as sort of aligned to what their needs are in their local communities and so on. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time, but space in general for me is such an interesting industry. It's so hard to really know what's going to happen, because the technology is constantly changing and the market is constantly changing. So I think it keeps us all on our toes, and I will be very interested to see what happens in the next 5 years.
Yeah, I hope that there's a lot of collaboration also between India and Indian new space companies and South Africa as well in the future. So I thank you very much for spending an hour of your time, giving some extremely good insights on all of this, and hopefully we can, catch up in a future episode, few years ahead, in reviewing a lot of this.
Yeah, I hope that it was accurate, but I mean, with it's all 2020 in hindsight. So this has been amazing, Narayan, and I really just want to thank you again for the opportunity. I'm really excited about what's happening in India, and likewise what's happening in a lot of the sort of more periphery countries, and just the adoption of space and so on. So it's going to be an interesting time ahead. Definitely. Thanks so much.